Hey, welcome back. So at the end of last year, I did a video on developer tech trends where I looked at what technologies I thought would be important for the web and mobile stack for 2022. And we looked at some of the more mainstream technologies, and we also looked at some of the up and coming trends. So in this video, I'm going to go back through that. We're going to look at some of the new technologies that have emerged since then. And then I'm going to see if I was right on some of the technologies and things that I thought would be important this year. So let's start with the web. In fact, we'll start with the browser, and then we'll work our way across the other channels such as mobile and then down the stack. Now, as far as browser is concerned, there is only two languages that run within browser. The first is JavaScript and the other is WebAssembly. Doesn't matter what you are, whether you're a Flutter, whether you're a TypeScript, whether you're a Blazor or you're Kotlin native, it doesn't matter. You are going to be compiling down to one of those two languages. If you remember in the previous video, I made a claim about 2022 that we would lean more and more into modern JavaScript. And what I specifically meant by that in that video is two things would occur. Number one, we would write modern JavaScript, i.e. ES 2015 plus syntax up to ES 2020-21 natively. So what we would do is not be hanging on to old language constructs like requires, etc., and we'd be using imports, async awaits, etc., arrow functions, and that would just be a modern part of our development. So the past would be left behind, and we would just embrace those language syntax. And I think that it's fair to say that is happening. So I'm sticking with that as a trend. The second part of that is we often use tools such as Babel or even use TypeScript compile options to be able to compile down to an earlier version of JavaScript. So the reason we do that is so that we can have that support for older browsers. But that, of course, comes at a cost, and the cost is performance. Now, probably the big hangover that's been occurring has been IE 11. There's still a lot of people that exist in IE 11 and maybe some of those older browsers, and therefore we are making a higher performance hit for the modern browsers to support those older browsers and not break the web. So there has been some changes this year, which I think proves my position even further, which is IE 11 goes end of life June the 14th. So therefore that excuse about having to support IE starts to go away a little bit because it's end of life and a lot of people are going to be moving away from that. Now, there is still going to be some older browsers that are kicking around and people are going to want to have that backward compatibility. But I think we might be at this breaking point where we will start to say, you know what, I'm not going to cross compile this down to an earlier version of JavaScript, and I'm going to start taking ES 2015 plus and assume the browser has support. Now, there will be some people who will say, you know what, I will maybe do a little bit of a check and then decide which bundle I'm going to download. Maybe it will be an ES 2015 plus bundle, or it will be a sort of ES5 below. And I understand there will still be some people that are doing that, but I think this world of us always compiling down to the lowest common denominator is going to start to go. So I think that trend that I said is going to stick true. So, yay, we're going with that. And I expect that to accelerate even further over the next few years. So the second trend that I said is that I'm seeing TypeScript adoption just getting greater and greater, increasing all the time. And you know what? I'm going to double down on that, right? So in the last 6 months, the amount of people using TypeScript by default as a starting point has just increased massively, especially in this place that I work and the customers I work with. And I just see that increasing. So if you're a JavaScript developer who hasn't embraced TypeScript already, really now is the time to be picking that up and doing that. I also claimed in that video, I do see that in the future that some of this is going to merge together. And we're already starting to see that with, ECMAScript proposals where types are going to be proposed to be a part of JavaScript language. So this sort of merging together of TypeScript and JavaScript and then becoming closer and closer, again, I think is just going to increase as time goes by. So these are two trends I'm sticking with, and I'm not sort of changing any of my position on that. So if we continue down the browser-based stack, I think a couple of the other things that I started to say was going to trend in 2022 was we talked about web frameworks. So in that previous video, I said that, of course, React is the grandmaster of the web frameworks. And people go, it's not a framework, that's a library. You know what I mean, though. So I think React still stays at the top there. It's a dominant library across the board. I do think that there's a lot of people using Vue, and that's increasing. And I know Vue just released Vue 3, which again makes it more and more powerful, and there's a lot more adoption coming from that. So I do think Vue is doing some really interesting things, but I do think the React is still going to continue to have that dominant position. And in fact, some of the things that I'm seeing, so later on this year, when they release React server components, I think that's going to double down even further. I like what they're doing with the preparation for things like React 18, so I think that's in a good space. I don't see that changing from a React perspective. For things like Angular, I'm not in love with Angular. I think the usage of Angular is going to go down as years go by. You know, we saw Angular.JS, the very original version of Angular, and I know that's completely different from current versions of Angular, but that went end of life, the end of last year. Angular, if you're working with that, that's great. I just don't see the adoption of that increasing. So maybe I'm wrong on that one, but I'm sitting on a negative on that one. The ones that are probably more interesting to me is going to be something like Svelte. I talked about that at the end of last year. I think its adoption is increasing. It's still really tiny in comparison to something like React. But you know what? It's a really interesting framework. Some of the things that make it interesting is the fact that it doesn't have a virtual DOM. It's really nice to work with, but of course it just doesn't have that mass adoption at the moment, but it is increasing. So we'll just sort of watch that over time. I'm still positive about Svelte. So would I pick it up and use it in an enterprise setting, and bet my company on it? Maybe not. Would I use it for my play stuff or any of my personal projects, or if I was a startup or something and trying to do interesting things? Absolutely. I think it's a great framework. Do I think its adoption is going to increase? I think so. Maybe if we were having this conversation 2-3 years time, maybe it's going to be one of the dominant framework and be as big as React, or maybe be as big as Vue. It's not there yet, but I think that will happen over time. Last one in the web library framework space that I've seen people start to talk about is Alpine.JS. I'm going to be honest, I haven't played with it at all. So I really couldn't comment on that. I don't know where that's going to go. So I'm sort of on a hold on that. I don't know whether that's going to trend upwards or downwards. Haven't got a clue, but it's something I'm going to check out, and then maybe we'll talk about it in a future video. So sticking with the web framework stack for a second and the front-end development tooling, one of the trends that I said in the previous video that I've been seeing is this hybrid world where previously tools would have been natively written in JavaScript, and now what we're seeing is a lot of tools being produced using something like Rust or GoLang. So we're getting into this sort of very hybrid world where you're going to write your web code maybe in JavaScript, but then the tools underneath that you are using to support you is necessarily going to be written in something like Rust or GoLang. And I see Rust is starting to become a bit of a leader in this space. And then in that hybrid world as well, especially in the back end where you used to be kind of reliant on just writing your JavaScript straight, then, being able to bring in modules written in Rust and then use interoperability between the two. So again, that's another trend that I'm seeing, but we especially see this in front-end development tooling, right? So things like WebPack, for example, is starting to look very, very slow. And if I look at the trends, and I've already done videos on this, then I see ESBuild is probably going to end up being that dominant sort of build tool. So it's obviously very fast at doing TypeScript compilation, actually. So a lot of tools are using ESBuild underneath the hood to do things like TypeScript compilation rather than the TypeScript compiler. So for example, Vite does that. Underneath the hood, it's using ESBuild, and I'll talk about Vite in a second. So I think ESBuild is probably huge in that space. It's super fast, but I think that is going to end up being the dominant bundler. It's written in GoLang rather than Rust, but I just think that's going to be the dominant tool. Now, if I look at something like the Next.JS stack, they're using SWC as their compiler under the hood. That is written in Rust. Now, you would be thinking, Chris, being a fan of Rust, that you would be leaning towards SWC. I don't think so. In my mind, ESBuild is going to really be the one that's got the ecosystem, the plugin market, etc. So I think that's going to be that dominant player. That means that I think if I look at the bundling space where we're using things like Webpack, Parcel, etc. today, I think over time, then ESBuild will become that replacement. Now, Vite, as it stands today, doesn't use ESBuild for its bundling because it wasn't as mature as it would like at that point for the various plugins. So they are still using Rollup at that point. But I really think that's going to change over time. So I think ESBuild is something that you probably want to invest in. So the other one that I sort of mentioned there was Vite. I'm seeing Vite have a huge take up. So obviously, in the past, we all use Create React App. In fact, I'm still sort of one of those people where if I want to knock up a React app very quickly, and then I type in the old Create React App. Vite does a great job, written by Evan Yu, so same person that created Vue, and he built that as a boilerplate front-end development toolkit so you can quickly spin up your applications, and it really is awesome. The only thing as I said, I don't really like about it is that it's not using ESBuild as its bundler, but I completely understand that. But again, it's a great tool. It gets you started fast. It's much quicker than Create React App. So I will do a video on Vite at some point. It's something you should check out. I think it really makes a difference to your development workflow. Another technology that I think is really interesting at the moment is something called MDX, which is the ability to provide JSX within your Markdown. So that is a really interesting approach. Again, it's been pushed by the Vercel folks. Love what they're doing. So the idea there is if you want to have documentation for your components, so it's really focused on components where you've got good JSX examples, etc. within that, then MDX is really emerging as a great format. And you see a lot of the design component library folks, Carbon, Material, etc., all starting to adopt MDX. And then people who are writing their own component libraries, putting MDX as part of that as well. So again, if you want to improve your documentation on your components, again, MDX is something that you might want to sort of trend into, because I'm seeing a lot of people pick that up. Again, another trend that I was starting to see at the end of last year, and I think is continuing this year, is that AI tools becoming a regular part of your web development stack. And we're already seeing this today for things like image optimization, font optimization, etc. But actually, if we think about what's going on in the space today, you've all seen things like DALL-E 2. You've obviously seen GitHub with their CoPilot. We can argue about whether that's any good or not as a separate point. But again, these AI tools becoming part of your development stack and being part of your web development frameworks is starting to become a thing. We've seen that already. I think that's going to continue on. Personally, I'm kind of excited about things like being able to have things like DALL-E 2 integrated into my stack so that I can automatically generate images, etc. I think that's going to be super exciting. But we're already using some of these tools, as I said, for things like image optimization, etc. And then, of course, other areas is things like automatically generating accessibility tags for images, etc. So I think there's lots of uses for AI. I think it's just going to become a regular part of our web development stack, and I think that's going to continue on going on in the future. The other ones that I want to talk about as well is things like server-side rendering. I said that was going to be a big thing. I still think that's going to be a big thing. Next.js is probably the dominant framework in the React side of things. Obviously, you've got the equivalents like Nuxt, etc., or SvelteKit for the other frameworks. How do I think that's going to change? I don't know, right? I mean, if I'm honest, if I look at something like Next.js, and I think it's a cool framework, but I feel as if I'm constrained within the framework. It's very opinionated, and I understand why it's that opinionated. But the major reason that I use Next.js in these cases is for the server-side rendering support, right? That is the key thing I use. And of course, Next.js comes with a whole load of other tools. It comes with various opinions. It's got the image optimization functionality, etc. But then when I look at something like Vite, which has got a lot of those capabilities, and they're building their own server-side rendering capabilities within there, then I start to see these two frameworks sort of start to compete. Which one will win? I'm going to be honest. Next.js, I don't think will win that. I think Vite is going to win that battle. And I think it's going to win that battle when React Server components come out. Because once React Server components come out, you're going to be looking at it and going, well, React is really going to be responsible for my server-side rendering. I'm going to be leaning in on things like Node.js streaming, the ability to to pull that from the edge. So the idea of having this sort of server-side thing sitting in the back end, rendering out my code, when I could be leaning into React Server components, I could be leaning into edge workers. And again, that's a trend that I think is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. We're already seeing that, things like Netlify and all that, leaning into edge. You see the Deno leaning into edge as well. I'll talk about that in a second. So as we lean more into edge and putting our web workers into edge, and making edge responsible for server-side streaming and server-side rendering, I think as React Server components comes out to support that, I think the use case for Next becomes less. And then as Vite becomes more mature as well, I just think we're going to end up in this Vite and React Server components plus edge, plus maybe some of the Rust tools, and I think we're going to pull away from something like Next.js. Again, I could be completely wrong, and I know Next.js is doing some amazing stuff in their framework, and they're doing some great work with React Server components. But if I was honest, as we move on to the second half of the year, maybe into early 2023, I think that trend is going to continue. Now, obviously, if Vite stops trending, then maybe Next.js will remain that dominant framework, but I don't think so. I think we're going to lean more towards kind of Vite plus React Server components, and therefore the use case, the reasons to use Next.js will back off a little bit. Just my opinion, but that's something for you to think about. So moving out of the JavaScript space for a second and moving into WebAssembly space. As I said in a previous video, I think WebAssembly is going to be absolutely massive. I think it's going to be one of the dominant frameworks in the future. You've seen a lot of videos from me about that. As this year has gone by, some of that is starting to prove quite a bit that WebAssembly is going to be more and more important in our browser space. Now, one of the things I would say is I don't think it will ever replace JavaScript. I think it will be augmented. I think the two things will come together. There will be some use cases where you'll lean more into a full JavaScript space, and there will be some use cases where you lean more into a full WebAssembly space. Maybe in a few years' time or 5 years' time, then WebAssembly will just become the dominant thing. But I see this hybrid world really being true. Now, there are a few things that are super interesting at the moment. So if I look across the stacks, I see everybody doing their usual trick, which is trying to replace JavaScript with your own web framework. So if I look in the Rust space, you've got Vue as a tool where you can build your own user interfaces completely in Rust, not use JavaScript at all, and then use Vue as the WebAssembly so that you can create your application on browser. Really interesting. Have we seen this trick before? I think we have, right? And I get it. So I think Vue is really interesting, but it's back down to this. I only want to write my code in one language, and I don't think you're going to replace JavaScript in that sense. So maybe we'll do a video on Vue. Maybe I'll change my mind on that one, but I don't think so. They're not the only ones playing the same trick. Flutter plays the same trick as well, right? So Flutter's got their Flutter for web. I mean, Flutter's been moving into multiple channels. They do mobile. Obviously, they do desktop. We'll talk about that in a second as well. So you could create your Flutter applications, transpile that down. I think it's still transpiling down to JavaScript at the moment, but they are looking at whether they can compile that down into WebAssembly. And the idea is you build your application once in Flutter, and then it can run on iOS, Android, Windows, Mac, ARM, whatever, and browser. Reality, I think Flutter is amazing. We'll talk about that on the other channels in a second. Is it going to replace web? I don't think so. I think web is still going to be JavaScript dominated. So Flutter's playing the same trick as Vue's playing. I understand it. I just don't think that'll happen. I do think there are use cases where you'll want a full end-to-end app. Like, Figma was a sort of perfect example where you have this really rich app. So it's less about being a web, but it's like having a really rich, powerful app running within the browser. I think that's kind of where Flutter and even things like Vue and all that could make a bit of sense there. But for regular stuff, I don't think so. I think we're going to live in this hybrid world. So next one in a similar space is Blazor, and I think Blazor is really interesting, actually. So the approach they've taken is slightly different from the other folks in a WebAssembly space. So normally in a WebAssembly, like like a U or something, they'll go, yeah, you don't need JavaScript anymore. You can just build your web applications in my thing. And that's super interesting. As I say, the approach Blazor has taken is quite different, and it's quite nice, actually. So, it's not designed, although you can run your application purely in a browser as WebAssembly, but it's more designed of like you're replacing ASP.NET, right? So you're writing what was your server-side web application that you would have done before normally, in the same way as you would have written something like an Actix or whatever if you're in the Rust space. But in this particular case, what you're basically doing is having server-side code that extends down into the browser, and they're using the client-side code there to execute. And that's where it makes it really interesting, because you can have these sort of fat servers and then basically stream the results down into your clients running on browsers. So this hybrid mode of being able to run applications locally and then have run applications in the back end, but then just to stream the results down. So I think what Blazor is doing with WebAssembly is really quite interesting. I'll probably cover that in another video. Again, are you going to use Blazor as a full replacement for your web applications for your JavaScript? I don't think so. But again, as I said before, like those where I need a dedicated application, running a Blazor in that case, like your Figmas, etc., could be really interesting. But I think it could be really interesting for things like, I'm thinking about like supermarkets, where you've got like the scanner tills and you're walking around the supermarket and you're scanning your barcodes and things like that. And they're typically written in sort of web technologies or little mobile apps or whatever. I start to see that world where the kind of, it's almost like the dumb terminals could then be running something like a Blazor, so you can have things, running server side, streaming that data down, and you've got some small amount of logic running a scanner. So I think Blazor could be really interesting in those scenarios. So I'll probably run a video on that, and we'll have a look at the differences between that and regular kind of WebAssembly and the WebAssembly it produces. But so that will be coming up at some point. But I think Blazor's doing some interesting things. Back to regular WebAssembly though, I do think Rust is doing interesting things in WebAssembly. I think JavaScript developers are going to have to learn Rust at some point, because I think this idea of writing some code in JavaScript and writing some code for WebAssembly will become the dominant thing. I do think Rust will become that dominant language. I love AssemblyScript, and I think maybe more people will start picking up AssemblyScript, but we are moving to this world where in the front end, WebAssembly is becoming more of what we do. So I just see that shift happening over time. So I think that prediction that I made stayed true. And then if I then follow my predictions into the back end with WebAssembly, then I said at the end of last year that WebAssembly is going to be more of a thing in the back end server side, and I'm doubling down on that. Right, from a trend perspective, I'm seeing that's becoming more of a thing. Right, the ability for you to take your applications, run some universal WebAssembly code that runs in the back end and can run on any framework, and then have lockdown permissions. I've got lots of videos on this already. That is going to become a thing. So I think Rust again will be the dominant player in that space, but that could change over time. But again, Blazor makes that really interesting as well. What I would say is I'm starting to see things like I'm seeing a lot of tools coming out at the moment. So folks like Fly.io, etc. I'm seeing WebAssembly Package Manager, etc. So there's a lot of people who are building frameworks so you can run WebAssembly natively on top of your backend server, so you don't need anything else to run on. And that becomes super light. They're going through startup stages, etc. They are going to be super interesting. And again, as these things mature, maybe it's very early in this space just now. Next trend I obviously want to cover is we covered a bunch of the web backends there for a second. I guess as far as I'm concerned, Express in the JavaScript framework land is probably still the dominant web server technology. I do believe in this hybrid world, so I think that more folks will be leaning towards things like Rust over time. So, you want that extra sort of performance. So, you start to look at it and say, well, can I host this in Rust? And over time, I think these worlds will mix together. What I would say, though, is looking at things like serverless, for example. So Google Cloud Functions, Azure Functions. And then as you start to look at how functions can then be running on the edge, I just think this idea of a web server, especially when we start to combine it with technologies that I said before, like Fly.io, Blazor, WebAssembly in general, as all of these trends come together, this sort of web server concept, I think will go away over time, over the next few years, and will be kind of more of function and WebAssembly modules, etc., for the back end, and this sort of fluidity will occur. So, Express is still going to be the dominant for however long for JavaScript perspective. And then when you look at other frameworks such as Rust, you're going to see things like Actix, and you're going to see, I've been playing with Salvo recently, and you'll see things like Axum, and they're all going to be completely valid over time. But I do think this move to edge and this concept of a central server will change as we go kind of forward. From an API perspective, REST is obviously always going to be around and be huge as normal. In the last video, I said GraphQL, more and more folks are leaning into that. I think that's continuing. I think Apollo GraphQL, and especially Apollo Federation, is probably the dominant in that one, and that will continue to be so. The other one that's probably pushing quite a bit is I'm seeing a lot of people lean into gRPC. Probably the reason I'm seeing that more than anything is that people want to keep that sort of latency down and have these smaller payloads. So especially for backend to backend transactions, rather than using REST, gRPC, because it's more of a kind of smaller binary format, people are getting a lot of results from that. So I'm seeing that sort of becoming more relevant as we go forward. So I'll probably cover some gRPC in some future videos. Do I think gRPC will become a thing between front end and like the web to back end? I'm not so sure I'm seeing this as back end to back end at the moment, but maybe there's some traction in sort of your React applications talking natively to gRPC. But I do think more people are leaning towards GraphQL still because of the ability to sort of combine and pull the exact data that you need over time. So I'm still leaning heavily into GraphQL, and I think gRPC is going to be huge as well. So I think that's going to be super interesting. Okay, so continuing along the stack, before we get into pure mobile, I want to cover VR and AR for a second. So Metaverse is becoming absolutely huge. I'm a big fan of Metaverse. I'm talking about Metaverse a lot. So therefore, building virtual reality and augmented reality apps is becoming a thing. In a previous video, I said, is it going to be a big thing in 2022? And I was sort of like, I think it's going to be more of a 23 thing. To be honest, I think I was completely wrong on this one. I just think so many companies are leaning into Metaverse and starting to build things out. So you as a developer, you as a technologist need to start thinking about that sooner rather than later. And it really is an extension of your sort of channel strategy. The technologies that I think are the big ones in this space is obviously Unreal, obviously Unity, and then but they're covering more the mobile platforms, less on the web platforms. I think the technology I think is most interested in from a web side of things is React 3 Fiber, which is a sort of React layer over the top of the 3JS library. Now, there is a lot of other technologies for web, so things like A-Frame and 3JS straight. Babylon is another one. I think React 3 Fiber will be the winner in this space, and I think the reason it will be the winner in this space is because it allows you to combine what you're doing with React on top of 3JS, which means that if you're a React developer, you can start building virtual reality and augmented reality experiences drawing upon your knowledge of JavaScript and React that you have today. And to be honest, the performance is super good. And then you can always bring that into something like a PW and run it. Of course, performance-wise, it's never going to be as good as something like a Unity or an Unreal app, a sort of native mobile app in that sense, but I think it's sort of good enough. Other things that are probably interesting, a lot of people are releasing sort of frameworks in that space. So I'm starting to see things like Niantic, the folks that did Pokemon Go, have started to release some augmented reality frameworks and toolkits. So again, I think that's really interesting. Microsoft's releasing their kind of Microsoft Mesh side of things, which again is super interesting. So I think augmented reality wise, virtual reality wise, we're all going to be pushing into the Metaverse, and therefore we're not just going to be dealing with that web channel. So I think that's going to be interesting. How that works out with WebAssembly over time, I think will be interesting as well. You know, I'm not seeing the movements of your kind of Blazors, etc. in that space. But who knows? I think when you want to start pulling those performance, that ability to combine JavaScript but with WebAssembly could start to become really interesting. So anyway, Metaverse, VR, AR is going to be huge. I think it's accelerating at a much faster pace than even I was sort of expecting. So I think that's something you lean into. And I will start covering some videos on React 3 Fiber and some of the other tech as we go along. All right, moving out of the kind of web space, I started to cover some of the mobile space. Let me talk about some of the movements there. We covered in the earlier video that from a native technology-wise, Swift and Kotlin were, for iOS and Android, were the dominant kind of forces. I'm seeing a big push towards declarative UI, so things like Swift UI, hugely popular. I'm seeing Jetpack becoming massive from an Android perspective, so I think that's just going to continue on. Kotlin native, etc. I'm not really seeing that pushing back into iOS. I understand their wishes and their movements in that case, but I do think if you're doing native iOS and Android development, then you're sort of leaning towards those toolkits. For the kind of cross platforms there, I don't see Kotlin native sort of picking up too much as people want to, but maybe that's just the world that I see. The two other frameworks that I see that are becoming a dominance is the React Native and Flutter. Flutter's released Flutter 3.0. They're doing some really interesting stuff, right? Flutter 3 is really good. It's built on a Dart language. They obviously want to expand that into web as well. As I said earlier, I don't see that happening, but who knows? I've been wrong. But I think if you're developing apps that can run for both iOS, Android at the same time, and you don't mind the cross-platform, then they are, Flutter 3 is a really hot platform. But what's really interesting is they're moving into the Windows space as well. So you can build your app and run it on Windows. You can run it on Mac. So that sort of thick client that you can run on your Mac or your PC, Flutter is making some interesting moves in that space. So if you think about it, you can run it on your mobile app, you can run it on your desktop. I think Flutter is going to be massive in that space. And I think we've underplayed the importance of desktop applications in the past. And I think Flutter is maybe moving into a space that we didn't think of. I've covered some Dart videos. I will do some more Dart videos over time. But again, I think that's something everybody should be paying attention. Will it play in the web? I'm not convinced, but that's just my opinion. React Native is doing similar things. Of course, you can build React Native applications for web and for mobile. I think that's really interesting. I don't think it's as mature as Flutter is. But again, that will change over time. But React Native, super good for kind of mobile applications. Next one that I probably want to cover is .NET MAUI. Again, it's the sort of next gen of Xamarin. You can do the same sort of thing. Cross-platform, run it on mobile. You can run it on Mac and etc. Am I a big fan of .NET MAUI? Probably not, because it's sort of, I'm an old C# developer as well, but it's next generation of Xamarin, and it feels like history kind of repeating itself. So between the .NET MAUI and a Flutter winning, I think a Flutter is going to win that battle. But again, for enterprise applications and people who write C#, I can see a space for that. Are people going to pick up a .NET MAUI over doing Swift UI or using Kotlin for native applications, or even a React Native, or some people, but not for modern ones. So, maybe I'm proven to be wrong on that, but that's just my opinion. It feels like a bit of history repeating itself. But again, I've not played with it, so I can't sort of say for sure. Anyway, I think this is kind of where I'm going to leave it today for Tech Trends. Hopefully this has been useful. It's an update of where we are. And again, I'll probably do this again in either 3 or 6 months again and just see how these predictions are going forward. Anyway, I hope this video has been useful for you, and I'll catch you on the next one.